Hello, I'm Heather Gibbons, and this is Hawthorne Valley's 50th anniversary podcast, Roots to Renewal. Over these past 7 months, we've been privileged to share the stories of our friends and contemporaries from around the world who dedicate their lives to meeting the ecological, social, and spiritual needs of our time. Roots to Renewal is made possible by the generous support of Tierra Farm, a family-owned, environmentally conscious manufacturer and distributor of organic dried fruits and nuts. Learn more at tierrafarm.org. In this episode, we're excited to share a follow-up conversation with our very first podcast guest, Frances Moore Lappé. We're delighted to acknowledge and celebrate the release of the 50th anniversary edition of her seminal book, Diet for a Small Planet. Once again, Frankie and our executive director, Martin Ping, engage in uplifting conversation on topics of the day that are also woven into Diet for a Small Planet: living democracy, the importance of listening, curiosity, and imagination in building frameworks of understanding, and fostering interconnectedness for the ultimate purpose of nurturing life on Earth. We are so grateful to Frankie for her time and generous spirit, and for the opportunity to continue our conversation so that we may share it with you now.
Thank you once again to be on our podcast. It was only, I think, 6 months ago or so where we had the chance to speak about your recent book then, and a little bit about Diet for a Small Planet in anticipation of this 50th anniversary edition coming out now. And we, of course, are celebrating our 50th at the same time.
Yeah,
so I feel
cool.
like we're walking this journey together, and I'm certainly grateful for that. I think that your book has withstood the test of time. I think your wisdom is more welcome and needed now than ever. We're facing so many challenges. It's hard to avoid having the immensity of the challenges just in our face, whether it's climate, whether it's social challenges. And to use your words, we need as individuals and as society to come to take seriously our capacities for expressing our values and interest in common problem solving. And so my question is, how do we do that? How do we come together at this time where it feels like we're just division and polarization are having their heyday?
Well, I start with the fact that I can back up is that we agree on more than we disagree on. And this theme of polarization is something that has been just thrown at us. But actually, it's quite dramatic. The percentage of way more than half of Americans agree that we have health care, that government ensures everyone access to affordable health care, that we tackle the climate crisis, that there's too much inequality in our country. Across a whole span of big concerns, there is more agreement than disagreement. And so I wrote a blog, if any of our listeners are interested. It's called The Muzzled Majority, because we don't often hear that majority view and how much we agree. So I just want to underscore that there is more agreement than disagreement, and we have much to build on. However, I think what you're alluding to is that we now have come to get our news from very different sources. So in a way, it's surprising there's so much unity, because those who lean red or are Republican identified tend to tune into Fox, for example, and those who lean blue read the New York, turn to the New York Times and NPR, for example. So we do get our news from different sources, and that is a problem, because I could go on about this, but there was a premise that was very much established from the 1950s on, that democracy needed to have voices interacting with one another, voices that disagreed and different points of view. And therefore, we had in place what was called the Fairness Doctrine, which required broadcasters to present more than one point of view. And then that was wiped out during the Ronald Reagan era. But that was really understood, that our speech had a public purpose as well as a private freedom purpose. And so I think returning to that idea that how do we ensure that diverse views actually engage with one another is a top priority for me.
Yeah, and that freedom of speech and like hearing multiple perspectives also goes to another question, which is the importance of listening. And you certainly speak to that in your book and really highlight that in order to have a healthy society, we need to become better listeners. I remember Jacob Needleman, he gave a beautiful talk out of his book, Why Can't We Be Good, where he describes listening as a moral act. And I think of my own physiology in that I come into the world with two ears and one mouth. And I think, God, will I ever learn to use them proportionately? That would be a good start for me. But I'm wondering if you can say more about how this seemingly simple act of listening can precipitate change, and what role does interest play in fostering that deeper listening?
Yes, and that is so problematic if we are just in these silos of different news sources. But I think the key is asking questions, asking questions. Personally, what I try to do, say, for example, on the power of the free market mythos, the word that you used in your outreach to me, or the free market ideology, to start there and say, okay, what is a free market? And how do we have a market where everyone can have a voice in it in true freedom, instead of just attacking, as often people who are troubled by this concentrated form of what I call brutal capitalism, they can be heard as saying that they are anti-free market. And I love to sort of turn that around and say, hey, I want to talk to you. How do we actually have a market that's free in the sense that we can all participate in it, that our voices are heard, and we have choices, not just for what is bringing in the highest return, but of what we really need. For example, in the food industry, nobody that I know of ever said, oh, yes, I want ultra processed foods in which they've taken out nutrients and thrown these additives at me. I mean, we didn't ask for that, but there was a lot of research done about how to market it. So I think part of listening is really starting with, okay, where can we agree? I mean, I think a market economy can work much better. I don't think we have many examples of a top-down economy that has worked. But how do we truly make it democratic in the sense that we have rails on it so that dangerous things aren't sold to us? You know, often people talk about the free market, but I love to say that all markets have rules, whether those rules are just the richest dominate, or like in our country, we have the rule that you can't sell harmful drugs. They have to be approved. You can't sell harmful, foods that will make people sick. So I just think part of listening is really trying to go for the heart of what we can agree on. Because I think a lot of people, whether red or blue, are very, very discouraged about how things are working right now.
Yeah, you speak, I know, in your book of the importance of imagination. And of course, you've written other books like What to Do After You Turn Off the TV, and how do we cultivate rich imagination to help us in our thinking beyond the problems that we've set up for ourselves or find ourselves in. And that resonates very well here at Hawthorne Valley, which is, with the Waldorf School, where we're recognizing imagination as one of the key tools. And just to think of the word image and to think, well, how do we think in images or think pictorially? And I think your book does that. And now when you're bringing up markets and the economy, I'm thinking of all of a sudden of Kate Rayworth's book, Donut Economics. She also says we should think in pictures, and she does this picture of the donut. And essentially the outer ring is the planetary limits that we should learn to live within, the natural laws of the planet that we're on. And then the inner ring is the kind of, I would call it the social contract below which no one should fall. Everyone should have a decent life. And I think it's so eminently doable. Like we could figure that out, and by listening to each other and by following some of the other recipes in your wonderful book.
Yes, I love that. And again, it's a framework of understanding that human beings create the rules together. It's not that there are no rules. There have to be rules and norms that we set and respect. And I think that our capacity to do that is so profound. But we have been sold this idea that, and perhaps the most dangerous, is this idea that fundamentally all you can count on is human selfishness. And of course, Adam Smith of The Wealth of Nations is often misused to convince us that that's who we are, the idea of just a self-interest driven market. But actually, Adam Smith himself talked about how we thrive because we know that self-love is depends upon our love for our neighbor and our neighbor's love for us. And also, this whole notion of the survival of the fittest really misunderstands Darwin, because in Descent of Man, he said that actually in tribal societies that we judged what's good or bad solely as it affected the welfare of the whole tribe, not just our little being. And so I think this idea that we're just selfish little shoppers is a big obstacle to believing in ourselves as truly capable of democracy. The key to me is that we know what brings out the best and the worst in us. And so let's get about setting the rules and norms that bring out the best. And I often talk about three premises for societies to work. A democracy needs a wide, inclusive distribution of wealth. And we need transparency. That is, we need to know what's going on. And we need a culture that's really about, not about blame, but about mutual accountability. And I often quote Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said, "Some are guilty, but we're all responsible." And so that idea that we can get out of the blame-shame game, which I think is so much in our culture, because we're told, oh, the market is fair, and if you're not making it, then it's your fault. And so I think there's a lot of shame, which then turns to blame. So I think this other way of thinking, that we fundamentally have this capacity for being brilliantly social and creating good rules that work for the whole tribe, so to speak, and that we can be very selfish if the rules really encourage that and bring out the worst.
You mentioned that the word interest comes from interest, to be among.
Oh, yeah.
And I just think that's so beautiful. And it's so wonderful to connect to what is the source of meaning in these words. And,
yes.
And then you quote this Bernard Crick: the more realistically one construes self-interest, right, the more one is involved in relationship with others.
Yeah, I should thank you for quoting him again, because I've forgotten how brilliant that line is, and absolutely true. And, I like trilogies, three things I can remember, right? So I was talking about the conditions that bring out the best in us. And another one of my trilogies is talking about our deepest human needs beyond the physical is our need for agency, power. That is, power is another word that often you think, oh, power, that's bad. But power comes from the word posse in Latin, which is just our capacity to act. Power is our capacity to create. So we need that, and we need a meaning in our lives, I believe, beyond just staying alive. And we need connection. And so with other people in community. And so I say we need power, meaning, and connection in fulfilling those needs. And if those needs aren't met in a socially constructive way, then what happens? What happens is gangs, because they can meet those needs negatively, or terrorists. You think about it, they're meeting some people's need even to kill themselves, to sacrifice their lives, but for power, meaning, and connection. So as long as we understand that this is not a few people, I think it's virtually all of us who need those needs met. And in our culture, we don't really acknowledge and feed and give people opportunity for those needs. And that's what I think the democracy movement, I love to capitalize the D and the M there, that the democracy movement is all about, of giving people that sense of power, meaning, and connection.
I'm deep in a book by Karen Barad called Oh my God, Meeting the Universe Halfway. And it's a book on quantum physics, so I'm way in over my head. But she speaks about agential realism, and it connected me when I was reading your draft for the 50th anniversary, where you actually talk about agency and power, and you also mentioned why is it that the vision that you're putting forward in that book is sometimes thought of as idealistic or
Right.
and not realistic, and who gets to define that?
Yes, and to me, it is the most realistic. It's saying that we humans know that we can be capable. I mean, having grown up during World War II and the Holocaust, I mean, I know I was born right in the midst of that. And we know now, if we didn't know before, that human beings can do the unspeakable to each other. And if the conditions are wrong, and we also know from our finest examples of our own society and others that humans can just achieve incredible good acts and that help all of us. So we know that we can be either, and that's the big teaching: is that if we accept that it's not blaming those bad people, but it's taking responsibility for setting and enforcing the rules that bring out our best selves. That is, our capacity for the connectedness, right, and our need for meaning beyond our own survival. And so I feel so strongly that this sense of ourselves is key to the whole question now of life on Earth. And so that's why when I wrote with a young man the book Daring Democracy, that we emphasized how much engaging within this rising democracy movement met our needs for what we call the thrill of democracy, that idea of having meaning together and doing what we could not do, and that excitement when we do, and meeting strangers who shared our passions, and realizing that we do have a voice, that we're really, the people in Washington really work for us. We drop this whole idea of a dull duty being, to make democracy work, and enliven with this is a way of living together that matches what humans most need, including big thrills, by doing what really takes courage with others.
You've pointed out in Diet for a Small Planet that we've inherited a kind of materialistic and mechanistic understanding of the world out of the age of enlightenment. And some now refer to as the story of separation, which is, I suppose, not entirely untrue, but also not a complete story. And you speak to a deeper truth of our ultimate interconnectedness and interdependence. And I'm just curious, what do you think prevents people from viscerally experiencing this as a deep slice of reality?
I would go back to my view of the shaming that is built into the messaging around the market, saying that, oh, it's competitive, and therefore if you don't make it, then it's your fault. And I think shame is one of the most difficult emotions for people to cope with. The only tool seems to be to blame others. And so one of the theme songs of my life is that we see the world not as it is, but as we are, through culturally determined filters. And so I say that, typically people hear the expression, seeing is believing, but actually, no. For human beings, believing is seeing. Albert Einstein, I'll go there to the to the top. He said, "It is theory which decides what we can observe." And so I think the more that we who have a worldview of connectedness, as one German philosopher told me, Frankie, in life there are no parts, only participants, Hans Peter Durer. And I just love that the more that we share, find ways to get across this idea that we are all creating each other moment to moment. There are no parts, only participants, and that we're not blaming. I mean, I've tried to avoid blaming language entirely, but rather really to look at the social conditions that bring out the best or the worst. I just think there's so much evidence that if we could bring people together, that's why I so had wished that when Obama started developing Obamacare, they call it, that we could have been in libraries and community centers across the country looking at different options and talking about them, And I still want that idea out there. I know this has been playing out in something called participatory budgeting. Have you ever encountered participatory budgeting?
Only where we work here.
Where you work there.
Yeah.
But anyway, it is a phenomenon that began, I believe, in Porto Alegre, Brazil, where a portion of the municipal budget was left to an assembly of citizens to decide how to allocate that. And it's gone global now. But these are just signs of what's possible, I think. And on the energy front, Georgia brought together people from the Sierra Club and people very concerned about the high cost of nuclear power. They brought them together and jokingly were called the Green Tea Party, and they came up with solutions that have created a lot of renewable energy in Georgia, made it one of the top 10, I think, in the country in one measure of a type of renewable energy. I think it's sun. So I really believe in this deliberative democracy approach.
Yeah, and for good reason, I think. And I'm so glad always for the illustrations and the reminders that move beyond the kind of contrasting and polarized views that seem to permeate the headlines. When you mentioned the German philosopher friend, for some reason it called to mind a Swiss philosopher I once heard who gave this incredible picture of, he said there are two futures. He called one futurum and one adventus. And futurum, he said, was the future that we put in our diaries and day planners and all the plans we make and we think are going to happen. He says, of course, oftentimes they become birdcage liners or something else. They don't always work out the way that we think. And adventus is the future that's actually coming towards us. And that is what we're going to meet sometimes, regardless of our conscious planning. And I don't know why that came up, but as we have this conversation, I'm reminded that we have to work with both. We have to plan, but we also have to remain open to what it is that's coming towards us and be prepared.
And one of the things that I most benefited from this call to write the 50th anniversary edition with the new opening chapter and new updated recipes and new recipes from top chefs. The reason, one of the reasons that I was so eager to do it is that I wanted to share some stories from the global South, from the poorest people on earth who are coming together and showing us the way. I think this is, humbling maybe. We think, oh, we in the industrial world, we're the ones who have the answers. But I tell the story of this group of women who are the lowest caste women in India. The Dalit women in Andhra Pradesh, where I visited them a number of years ago and realized that they were part of many villages of women who have moved away from chemical, corporate-driven agriculture and created ecological farming in their communities and have completely ended hunger in their communities. And in the process have, for example, the school lunches were just serving white rice, which is very low nutrition. And now in some of the states these women are working in, the state government is procuring their healthier grains. And the people I visited there had their own radio station. They petitioned 8 years to get the radio station so they could share what they're learning. And so I got to visit them and sit around on their straw mats and hear their stories. And as I was leaving their village, the most touching and moving moment happened because I was leaving the village. I was just delighted with what I learned. And as toward the taxi was taking me back to the city, And I heard these voices, wait, 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 kind of calling at me. And what they said, oh, we forgot to tell you the most important thing. And I said, what? And what we gained from our women's group, the most important thing was courage, courage. And I just thought that spoke volumes that by coming together, and because they had the men, their husbands had always been dominant, and they had just gone along with whatever. And by coming together as a group, the women found their courage. If a man in these villages hits a woman, the whole group of women goes to him and says, no, that does not allowed anymore in our village. That's just one example. I also tell a story of Niger, one of the world's poorest countries, where farmers have learned that trees and crops go together. They're not competing. So they have shown this whole pathway that has increased yields of crops while it's absorbed carbon, to meet the climate crisis, because they've encouraged trees to grow among the crops. And I could go on and on about all the multiple synergies in the crops and the trees. But now it is spreading through a number of parts of Africa. So I just want to encourage people to reach out for those stories of possibility, I call it, and they are often arising among the poorest.
Well, it's you've answered my final question in a way. We all need these stories. My question was going to be, Frankie, where do you find the courage to continue this good work that you're doing against all of the odds and noise out there, and real, certainly, and not to make light of it, real challenges with pandemics and drought and heat and floods and wildfires and social unrest. It's important for us to maintain that sense of hope and be possibilists, and also to take courage. And I find your book and your life and your work a real source of inspiration in that direction. So I can't thank you enough.
Oh, Martin, I thank you too. I just wanted to offer one more tool, may I?
Absolutely.
Because after I took part in 2016 in a life-changing moment when I didn't think I could walk 10 miles. I walked more than 100 from Philadelphia to Washington, and sat in on the Capitol steps for democracy reforms, money out of politics, getting rid of gerrymandering, voting rights. We got arrested. It was one of the biggest arrests ever on the Capitol steps. But out of that came I was absolutely convinced. As I approached the Capitol, I started weeping. And when I saw the dome, and I said, wait, they work for me. They work for me. And it was thrilling. And Adam Eichen, who I got to know really well on that trip, then we wrote a book together. And out of that came the tool I wanted to mention is www.democracymovement.us. And wherever you are, you can find out what's happening nationally and in your state, because there's a state map. You can click on it and see what's happening on key democracy reforms. Because I think everything that we've been talking about in this really enlivening for me conversation depends on our being able to have a democracy that's accountable to our interests, our values, and to the earth itself. And so this democracy movement, for me, it's not the dull spinach we have to get down to get our reward of desserts of personal freedom. That being part of this movement is thrilling, and it is enlivening, and it is contagious. So we hope to add to that contagion with this website. And if any of you listening have any feedback on it, again, it's just democracymovement.us, and you will find it. And that what would be most useful to you in it. And I hope that also the books that you and I, Martin, have mentioned will be helpful to people as well.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that tool, and I'm just reminded also that you mentioned in the recent draft You quoted Václav Havel, who I remember when he gave that speech to the joint session of Congress after he was elected president of the Czechoslovakia. I was actually driving home from Albany, and I had to pull over and just listen to it. I couldn't drive and listen. I was so spellbound by what this man was saying, this who I had followed and had read quite a bit of his work previously. And you had this quote, "One may approach democracy as one would the horizon, but it can never be fully attained. You Americans have thousands of problems as other countries do, but you have one great advantage. You have been approaching democracy uninterrupted for 200 years." And I remember when he gave that talk, and then afterwards, the whole joint session of Congress was silent for quite a bit of time. And Cokie Roberts or Nina Totenberg or somebody who was on NPR said that the congressmen and senators were just, some of them were openly weeping. And you realize what a beautiful, fragile experiment we have in this democracy and how much it's up to each one of us to actually make it work or not. We can't leave it to anyone else. So thank you for the tool. And I do encourage everyone to take you up and use it. And thank you for your words, and congratulations on the 50th anniversary of Diet for a Small Planet. Thank you for writing it and rewriting it. And I'm just so inspired and so humbled, and really leaves this conversation, like I did the last time we spoke, so uplifted. So thank you so very much, Frankie. And we wish you all the best. I hope millions more read the book.
Well, it's a great honor always to talk to you, because I feel that we do really share such deep values and always learn from each other. So thank you.
If you haven't done so already, we encourage you to go back and listen to episode 1, our first inspiring conversation with Frankie. We also highly recommend checking out the celebratory new special edition of Diet for a Small Planet. It includes a new opening chapter sharing Frankie's personal journey of how this book shaped her life and how plant-centered eating can help restore our damaged ecology, address the climate crisis, and move us toward real democracy. The new edition also includes a fully revised and updated recipe section and contributions from some of the country's best plant-centered cookbook authors and chefs. It is available at her website, dietforasmallplanet.org. If you're interested in learning about what's happening on key democracy reforms in our country and in your state, please be sure to check out the website democracymovement.us. Thanks for listening to Hawthorne Valley's Roots to Renewal podcast. We are an association comprised of a variety of interconnected initiatives that work collectively to meet our mission. You can learn more about our work by visiting our website at hawthornevalley.org. Hawthorne Valley is a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we rely on the generosity of people like you to make our work a reality. Please consider making a donation to support our work. If you'd like to help us in other ways, please spread the word about this podcast by sharing it with your friends and leaving us a rating and review. Special thanks to our sponsor, Tierra Farm, who makes this podcast possible, and to Grammy Award-winning artist Aaron Dessner for providing our soundtrack. Finally, we'd like to thank Aaron Ping for once again lending his editing expertise. In the months to come, join us as we release episodes featuring some of our amazing Hawthorne Valley co-workers on the topics of art and agriculture.